A few days after my conversation with the grandchildren, I found myself thinking about something Thomas used to say whenever we cleaned out closets together. Don't let old boxes become permanent furniture. He always laughed after saying it. His point was simple. If something had been sitting untouched for years, it was probably time to decide whether it still belonged in our lives. For a long time after his funeral, I couldn't bring myself to open the boxes he had left behind. They remained exactly where I had placed them, stacked neatly inside the hallway closet, covered with a thin layer of dust. Every time I walked past them, I told myself I would go through them tomorrow. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became another month. Grief has a way of postponing ordinary tasks. Not because they're difficult, because every ordinary object suddenly carries extraordinary memories. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep walking past those boxes forever. Not because I was ready. I wasn't. But because avoiding them wasn't helping me heal. That morning, I carried the first box into the dining room and placed it carefully on the table. Sunlight streamed through the windows, falling across the worn cardboard lid. For several moments, I simply stood there looking at it. Then I took a slow breath and opened it. Inside were the kinds of things every long marriage quietly collects. Old warranty papers, insurance policies, instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned, canceled checks, holiday cards, receipts from vacations taken years ago. Nothing dramatic, nothing valuable. Yet every folder somehow reminded me of another season of our life together. I smiled when I found the receipt for the refrigerator Thomas insisted we didn't need. We'll make the old one last another 5 years, he had argued. It lasted 6. I laughed softly to myself. Another envelope contained ticket stubs from a concert we attended during our 30th wedding anniversary. I had forgotten we kept them. Thomas hadn't. That was who he was. He believed ordinary moments deserved to be remembered. The more papers I sorted, the more I realized these weren't simply financial records. They were pieces of a life. 42 years of marriage quietly preserved inside folders and envelopes. One document at a time. Hours passed without me noticing. I organized everything into neat piles. Insurance, property records, tax documents, bank statements, credit card statements. I wasn't searching for anything in particular. My goal was simply to bring order to the paperwork Thomas had always managed so carefully. He used to joke that if either of us ever needed an important document, it would always be exactly where it belonged. He wasn't exaggerating. His filing system was meticulous. Every folder was labeled, every receipt dated, every statement arranged in chronological order. That made what happened next even more surprising. Near the bottom of one box, I found an envelope labeled only with the name of the credit card company. Nothing unusual. We had used the same joint credit card for years, mostly for groceries, gas, travel, home repairs. I almost placed the envelope into the stack without opening it. Then I hesitated. For reasons I couldn't explain, I decided to look inside. There were several monthly statements. I glanced at the first page. Nothing immediately caught my attention. I wasn't looking for suspicious charges, only trying to decide where the paperwork belonged. After all, credit card statements are rarely interesting. I turned another page, then another. Most of the purchases looked familiar. Hardware stores, restaurants, the pharmacy Thomas always preferred. Everything reflected the ordinary rhythm of our lives before he became ill. I continued flipping through the statements almost absent-mindedly. Then one date made me stop. I looked at it again, slowly, carefully. The payment date printed near the bottom of the page occurred nearly 3 weeks after Thomas had died. At first, I assumed I had picked up the statements in the wrong order. Perhaps I was looking at an older balance being processed later. That seemed entirely possible. Credit card billing cycles often overlap. I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. I reached for the next statement. Another payment appeared. Again, after Thomas's death. I frowned. Perhaps these were automatic payments. That would make sense. Many recurring expenses continue unless someone cancels them. I kept reading. Then I noticed another transaction. And another. Each one carried a date after the funeral. I leaned back in my chair. My heartbeat had become just a little faster. Not because I believed I had discovered something improper. Not yet. There are many ordinary reasons why charges or payments can appear after someone dies. Pending transactions, recurring subscriptions, delayed processing, estate administration. I knew enough about finances to understand that. Still, Something inside me urged me to slow down. I placed the statements neatly side by side across the table, one after another, reading each page much more carefully than before. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply trying to understand what I was seeing. The dates, the descriptions, the sequence. For the first time since opening the boxes that morning, I no longer felt as though I was sorting old paperwork. I felt as though I was beginning to read a story I had somehow overlooked. Outside, the afternoon sun continued drifting across the windows. Inside, I turned another page, then another. With every statement I read, one thought quietly remained in the back of my mind. The name on that credit card belonged to a man I had loved for 42 years. A man who was no longer alive. Yet the account continued telling a story that did not end on the day we buried him. I didn't know what that story meant. Not yet. But for the first time since I had opened those dusty boxes, I realized there might still be parts of Thomas's life, and the weeks after his death, that I had never fully understood. Once I noticed the dates on the credit card statements, I found it impossible to stop reading. What had started as a simple afternoon of organizing paperwork had quietly turned into something else. I pulled every statement from the envelope and spread them across the dining room table. The papers covered nearly the entire surface. For years, Thomas had been the one who balanced our accounts. Not because I wasn't capable of doing it, simply because he enjoyed keeping everything organized. He often joked that reconciling bank statements was his version of solving crossword puzzles. I used to tease him that no one else in America considered financial paperwork a hobby. He would smile and answer, "Maybe not, but at least I'll always know where our money goes." And he usually did. Thomas believed every dollar should have a purpose, not because he was cheap, because he respected what it had taken to earn it. We both grew up in families where money wasn't wasted. That habit stayed with us throughout our marriage. We planned before making major purchases. We talked before using our savings. Neither of us enjoyed spending money simply to spend it. Looking at those statements now, I found myself remembering that part of him very clearly. I picked up the first statement and began reading each transaction carefully. At first, everything seemed familiar. The grocery store we visited almost every Saturday. The neighborhood pharmacy. Gas stations. A hardware store where Thomas bought supplies for little repairs around the house. Those purchases made perfect sense. Then the pattern changed. Halfway down one page, I noticed a charge from an upscale clothing boutique. I paused. The name of the store sounded familiar. Not because we had shopped there, because I had walked past it many times at the mall. Its window displays featured expensive designer clothing. Thomas had never been interested in places like that. In 42 years of marriage, I could probably count on one hand the number of times he bought clothing without me insisting he needed new shirts. He liked practical things. Comfortable shoes. Simple jackets. Nothing extravagant. I looked more closely at the amount. It wasn't a small purchase. I turned to the next page. Another unfamiliar merchant appeared. This time, a jewelry store. Again, I frowned. Thomas had purchased jewelry for me exactly 3 times that I could clearly remember. Our 10th anniversary. Our 25th anniversary. And the pearl earrings he surprised me with after Daniel graduated from college. Every one of those gifts had been carefully planned. He would never have forgotten telling me about another purchase. Especially one of that size. I continued reading. A spa. I blinked. Thomas believed a relaxing afternoon meant sitting on the back porch with a cup of coffee. He barely tolerated haircuts. The idea of him booking a spa appointment seemed almost amusing. Another statement. Another unfamiliar purchase. A luxury furniture showroom. I slowly leaned back in my chair. That one puzzled me even more. Thomas loved our furniture because every piece carried a memory. He repaired old chairs instead of replacing them. He refinished our dining room table himself rather than buying a new one. Whenever I suggested updating the living room, he would laugh. Why replace something that still tells our story? That was the man I knew, not someone browsing expensive furniture stores. I set the statement down beside the others. For several minutes, I simply stared at the pages spread across the table. One unusual purchase might not mean very much. People buy gifts. They surprise one another. They occasionally shop somewhere unexpected. That happens. Several unusual purchases still didn't necessarily prove anything. Life isn't always predictable. Perhaps there were explanations I simply didn't know yet. I reminded myself of that. Again and again. I took out a legal pad and began making notes. Not conclusions. Only observations. clothing boutique, jewelry store, spa, luxury furniture retailer. I wrote each merchant name beside its corresponding date. Then I looked for another pattern. That's when I noticed something that unsettled me more than the purchases themselves. The timing. Almost every unfamiliar transaction appeared during the weeks immediately following Thomas's death. I checked the calendar I kept beside the desk, then compared it with the statements. The dates matched. One purchase occurred less than a month after the funeral. Another followed only days later. Then another. The closer I looked, the more my attention shifted away from where the money had been spent. Instead, I found myself asking when. Timing often tells its own story, sometimes more clearly than the transaction itself. I wasn't accusing anyone. I couldn't. I simply didn't know enough. Perhaps every purchase had a perfectly reasonable explanation. Perhaps some charges had been authorized before Thomas passed away. Perhaps others related to matters I had never handled personally. There were still far too many possibilities to consider. But I also couldn't ignore what I was seeing. These didn't resemble the spending habits I had known throughout our marriage. Thomas was many things. Generous, thoughtful, patient. He loved surprising the grandchildren with ice cream after baseball games. He quietly donated to charities without telling anyone. But he wasn't impulsive. He never spent large amounts without discussing them with me first. That habit had remained unchanged for 4 decades, which made these statements feel strangely unfamiliar. Not because I recognized wrongdoing, because I no longer recognized the story they seemed to tell. I carefully stacked the papers back into chronological order. Then I reached for the small notebook that had slowly become my companion over the past several weeks. On a fresh page, I wrote only facts. Several purchases at businesses Thomas rarely, if ever, visited. Transactions include clothing, jewelry, spa services, and luxury furniture. Many dates occur after Thomas's passing. I underlined nothing. Added no question marks. No theories. Only the details I could verify with my own eyes. Closing the notebook, I rested my hands on the table. The room had grown noticeably darker. Without realizing it, I had spent nearly the entire afternoon studying those statements. Outside, the first porch lights were beginning to turn on across the neighborhood. Inside, I remained seated, thinking about the man I had shared 42 years with. I knew Thomas's habits. I knew his values. I knew the quiet satisfaction he found in living simply. That certainty made these unfamiliar purchases difficult for me to understand. Not impossible, simply difficult. And as I gathered the statements into a neat stack once more, one thought refused to leave me. Sometimes the most revealing part of a financial record isn't the amount of money spent. It's the quiet realization that the person described by the transactions no longer resembles the person you knew by heart. The next morning, I carried the credit card statements downstairs. I had slept very little the night before. Not because I believed I had uncovered proof of something terrible. I hadn't. The statements raised questions. They did not answer them. I reminded myself of that over and over again. Questions deserve explanations before they deserve conclusions. That had always been Thomas's philosophy. I intended to follow it. I slipped the statements into a plain manila folder and placed them on the kitchen table. For nearly an hour, I debated whether I should bring them up at all. Perhaps I was overthinking everything. Perhaps there was an explanation so ordinary that I would feel embarrassed for worrying. Credit card companies process payments in different ways. Charges don't always appear immediately. Pending transactions sometimes take days to post. I knew all of that. Still, the unfamiliar stores continued to bother me. Eventually, I heard Vanessa come downstairs. She walked into the kitchen carrying a basket of folded laundry. She smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Margaret." "Good morning." She set the basket on the counter. "You've been up early." "I couldn't sleep." "I'm sorry. I've been organizing some of Thomas's paperwork." She nodded sympathetically. "I imagine that's difficult." "It is." There was genuine kindness in her voice. Or at least it sounded that way to me. I took a slow breath. "I was hoping you might help me understand something." "Of course." She pulled out a chair and sat across from me. "What did you find?" I opened the folder and slid one of the statements toward her. I noticed several charges that appeared after Thomas passed away. I wasn't sure whether I was reading them correctly. Vanessa glanced down at the statement. She didn't study it for very long. Only a quick look. Then she nodded almost immediately. "Oh, I think I know what you're seeing." "You do?" "Yes." She gently pushed the paper back toward me. Credit card transactions don't always post the day something is purchased. I listened carefully. Sometimes a purchase is made on one day, but the payment isn't processed until several days later. She smiled, reassuringly. It happens all the time. I nodded. I've heard that before. Exactly. So seeing a later posting date doesn't automatically mean the purchase happened after that date. Her explanation made perfect sense. Anyone who has used a credit card long enough has probably noticed delayed transactions. Restaurants, hotels, online orders. Some merchants take longer than others. There was nothing unusual about that explanation. I looked back at the statement. I suppose that's possible. It definitely is. She sounded completely confident. Then she pointed toward one of the entries. Some businesses don't finalize charges immediately. They authorize them first. Then they settle everything later. Again, entirely reasonable. I found myself nodding. For a moment, the tension I'd been carrying began to ease. Maybe I had misunderstood what I was seeing. Maybe the dates weren't telling the story I thought they were. Then another question quietly entered my mind. I understand the timing. I tapped the page gently. But what about the stores? She glanced at the statement again. The clothing boutique, the jewelry store, the spa, the furniture showroom. I don't remember Thomas shopping at places like those. Vanessa looked thoughtful for a second. Then she gave a small shrug. Sometimes the merchant name on a statement isn't very clear. I've had charges appear under names I didn't recognize. I had to look them up later. I considered that. She wasn't wrong. Many businesses process payments under corporate names that look unfamiliar. I've experienced that myself. Then she continued. And remember, some companies own several different stores. So the name on the statement doesn't always match the sign you see outside. Again, a perfectly reasonable possibility. She wasn't speaking quickly. She wasn't defensive. She simply answered each question as though we were solving a small puzzle together. I noticed how calm she remained. No frustration. No irritation. Only quiet confidence. Finally, she smiled warmly. Margaret, I really don't think you need to worry. Credit cards can be confusing. They're full of delayed postings, processing dates, and merchant codes. It looks strange sometimes, but it's usually much simpler than it appears. Her tone was comforting, the kind of voice people use when trying to reassure someone they care about. I looked down at the papers again, then back at her. I hope you're right. I really think I am. She reached over and lightly touched my hand. I know you've been sorting through a lot since Thomas passed. It's easy to notice something unexpected and assume the worst. I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying these statements can be surprisingly misleading. I appreciated that she hadn't dismissed my questions. She hadn't laughed. She hadn't become angry. She had simply offered explanations, one after another, each one plausible, each one grounded in something that could genuinely happen. After she returned upstairs, I remained alone in the kitchen. I looked once more at the statements spread across the table. Then I picked up my notebook. For several minutes, I stared at the blank page before writing anything. Finally, I wrote only what I knew. Vanessa explained that credit card transactions may be processed days after a purchase. She said merchant names on statements don't always clearly identify where something was bought. She believes nothing unusual appears in these records. I closed the notebook. I wasn't writing because I had accepted every explanation, nor was I writing because I had rejected them. I simply wanted to remember the conversation accurately, without changing it later in my memory. As I gathered the statements back into their folder, I realized something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. If I had been looking only at the dates, or listening only to Vanessa's explanation, I probably would have stopped asking questions. Her answers sounded calm, logical, entirely possible, and perhaps they were correct. I didn't know yet. But I also knew something Thomas had told me many years earlier whenever we balanced our finances together. Never confuse a possible explanation with a complete explanation. At the time, he had been talking about bookkeeping. Sitting alone at the kitchen table that morning, I found myself wondering whether his advice applied to much more than numbers. After my conversation with Vanessa, I decided to speak with Daniel. Not because I wanted him to take my side. And certainly not because I wanted to create another disagreement in the family. I simply hoped he might look at the credit card statements with fresh eyes. Daniel had always been practical. Whenever something broke around the house, he would take it apart piece by piece before deciding whether it could be repaired. He never guessed when it came to fixing an engine or assembling furniture. He preferred to understand how something worked before making a decision. I wondered if he would approach these statements the same way. That evening, He came home just after 6. He looked tired, but he smiled when he saw me in the kitchen. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart. Everything okay? I was hoping you could look at something when you have a minute." "Sure." He loosened his tie, poured himself a cup of coffee, and joined me at the dining room table. I handed him the folder. "I found these while organizing your father's paperwork." He opened it without hesitation. "What am I looking at?" "Some credit card statements. I noticed several transactions that were posted after your father's passing. I've been trying to understand them." Daniel nodded. He began flipping through the pages. For the first minute or two, he appeared focused. He scanned the statements quietly. Occasionally, his eyes paused on a line before moving to the next page. I waited without saying anything. I didn't want to influence what he noticed. After only a few minutes, he closed the folder. "I think it's probably okay." I looked at him. "What makes you say that?" He shrugged. "I talked to Vanessa about credit card statements before. She mentioned that charges sometimes show up days or even weeks after they're made." "That happens." I nodded. "She told me something similar." "Exactly. So that's probably what's going on." I gently reopened the folder. I was wondering, did you notice the transaction dates? He glanced back down. "Not really. I mostly looked at the statements overall." "What about the merchant names?" "I didn't pay much attention to those either." His answer wasn't careless. It was honest. I asked another question. "Would you mind comparing the posting dates with the transaction dates?" He smiled apologetically. "I don't think we need to go that far." I honestly think Vanessa's explanation makes sense. There was no frustration in his voice, no impatience. He simply sounded convinced that the simplest answer was probably the correct one. I looked down at the papers, then back at my son. What if there are still questions? I'm sure there are answers. I just don't think there's any reason to assume something is wrong. Again, a reasonable response, one that many people might have given. I noticed something, though. Daniel hadn't compared the dates. He hadn't looked for supporting receipts. He hadn't suggested contacting the credit card company or the bank to better understand the records. He hadn't tried to verify the explanation one way or the other. He had simply accepted the first explanation that seemed to fit, not because he was unwilling to learn more, because he already believed he understood the situation. I asked quietly, would it help to call the card company and ask how these transactions were processed? Daniel smiled. I don't think that's necessary. I'm sure it's just normal credit card timing. He pushed the folder gently back toward me. I really wouldn't worry about it. Our conversation lasted only a few more minutes. Then he stood up. I should go help the kids with homework. Before leaving the room, he gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. Everything's going to be okay, Mom. I hope so. I know so. Then he walked upstairs. I remained at the dining room table long after he disappeared. The folder still rested in front of me, exactly where he had left it. For a while, I didn't think about the transactions at all. Instead, I thought about Daniel. My son had always been one of the kindest people I knew. Growing up, he was the child who believed everyone deserved another chance. If two classmates argued, Daniel always assumed there had been a misunderstanding. If someone missed an appointment, he believed they probably had a good reason. Trust came naturally to him. Thomas admired that quality. So did I. Kindness is a beautiful thing. The world needs more people who begin with trust instead of suspicion. But sitting there alone, I realized something that saddened me. Trust and verification are not the same thing. You can trust someone deeply and still check the facts. You can believe the best about people and still ask another question. One doesn't cancel out the other. Looking back over our conversation, I realized Daniel hadn't reached his conclusion by examining the statements. He had reached it because he trusted the explanation that had already been offered. There was a difference, a small one, but an important one. I wasn't disappointed because he believed Vanessa. She was his wife. It was natural for him to trust her. What made me quietly sad was something else. He never seemed curious enough to find out whether the explanation could be confirmed. Not by comparing dates, not by reviewing receipts, not by asking the bank how the charges had been processed. The first answer had satisfied him. The search ended there. I picked up my notebook and wrote only a few lines. Daniel reviewed the statements briefly. He believes the delayed processing explanation is likely correct. He did not compare transaction dates or suggest requesting additional records. I closed the notebook and rested my pen on top of it. As I looked once more at the folder, I realized the numbers on those statements were no longer the part that troubled me most. Financial records can usually be explained with enough information. What stayed with me instead was something much quieter. My son had always trusted people before paperwork. He believed character mattered more than documents. There is kindness in living that way. There is generosity. But I also found myself wondering whether sometimes the people we love most deserve not only our trust, they also deserve our willingness to pause, look a little closer, and make sure the story we believe is supported by the facts in front of us. The morning after my conversation with Daniel, I decided to continue organizing Thomas's office. If the credit card statements had raised questions, I hoped the rest of his records might provide context. Not answers, just context. Thomas believed every important document belonged somewhere specific. He often joked that if anyone ever needed to understand our finances, they could do it simply by following his filing system. For 42 years, that system had never failed us. His office still looked almost exactly as he had left it. The oak desk sat beneath the window overlooking the backyard. His reading glasses rested beside a yellow legal pad filled with neat handwriting. A coffee mug, long since emptied, remained on the corner of the desk. No one had moved it. I had thought about washing it many times. Every time I reached for it, I stopped. Some ordinary things become difficult after someone is gone. Not because they matter financially, because they quietly remind you that a person once occupied that space. I sat down in Thomas's chair. The leather creaked softly beneath me. For just a moment, I closed my eyes. I could almost picture him sitting there, balancing the checkbook, reviewing insurance papers, making little notes in the margins of envelopes. He never rushed through paperwork. He believed careful records prevented unnecessary confusion later. I smiled. Then I opened the top drawer. Inside were the usual supplies: pens, paper clips, a stapler, several neatly labeled folders. Everything exactly where Thomas would have wanted it. I began sorting through them one by one. Property tax records, utility bills, insurance renewals, old warranties. Nothing unusual. Everything matched the organized life we had built together. Near the back of the drawer, however, I noticed a small folded receipt tucked inside an envelope. It wasn't filed with anything else. It looked as though Thomas had temporarily placed it there, intending to organize it later. I unfolded it carefully. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary retail receipt. I almost set it aside. Then one detail caught my attention: the date. Something about it seemed familiar. I reached for the stack of credit card statements lying beside me. Slowly, I compared the receipt with the statement from the same period. The dates matched. Exactly. For a moment, I felt relieved. Perhaps this was exactly what I had been hoping to find. Supporting documentation. Something that explained one of the transactions. I looked more closely. Then I frowned. The purchase described on the receipt didn't appear to match what I expected. The receipt listed a practical household item. Nothing expensive. Nothing unusual. The description was simple. The corresponding entry on the credit card statement, however, appeared under a merchant name that suggested something entirely different. I read both documents again. Then a third time. Perhaps I was misunderstanding the merchant description. Perhaps the business sold more than one type of product. Perhaps the receipt represented only part of the purchase. Several perfectly ordinary explanations came to mind. I wrote each possibility on a notepad rather than dismissing any of them. Over the past several weeks, I had learned an important lesson. Questions deserve patience, not assumptions. Still, the more I compared the two documents, the more I realized they didn't seem to fit together as neatly as I had expected. Not necessarily incorrectly. Simply, not clearly. I placed both papers side by side beneath the desk lamp. The date matched. That much was easy to verify. The purchase itself was less clear. I leaned back in the chair and thought about Thomas. If he had been sitting where I was now, what would he have done? I already knew the answer. He wouldn't have guessed. He would have gathered more information. That had always been his way. Facts first. Opinions later. I smiled quietly. You'd probably tell me to slow down, I whispered. Then I reached for my notebook. Instead of writing a conclusion, I wrote only what I could confirm. Found a receipt in Thomas's desk. Date matches one of the credit card transactions. Description on the receipt does not appear to clearly match the transaction listing. Needs clarification. I underlined those final two words. Needs clarification. Not proof. Not evidence of wrongdoing. Simply another question that deserved an answer. As I closed the notebook, I realized something had changed in the way I was approaching all of this. A few weeks earlier, I probably would have accepted the first explanation offered to me. Now I found myself comparing documents, checking dates, looking for records, not because I wanted to prove anyone wrong, because I wanted to understand what had actually happened. There is an important difference between those two goals. One begins with a conclusion. The other begins with curiosity. I wanted curiosity, nothing more, nothing less. The afternoon sunlight had shifted across the room by the time I finished organizing the remaining folders. Most of them contained exactly what I expected. Routine paperwork, orderly records, nothing surprising. Only that single receipt continued resting beside the credit card statement. Neither document accused anyone. Neither document explained itself completely. Together, however, they quietly suggested that at least one transaction deserved a closer look. That realization stayed with me long after I left Thomas's office. Not because I believed I had discovered the truth, because I knew I hadn't. The truth was still somewhere ahead of me. All I had found was one small inconsistency. Sometimes those inconsistencies have simple explanations. Sometimes they reveal something more. I had no way of knowing which this would become. As I carefully placed both papers into the folder with the other financial records, I reminded myself of the promise I had made after Thomas's funeral. Never let fear write the story. Let the facts do that instead. For now, the facts were telling me only one thing. At least one transaction no longer fit neatly with the paperwork I had found. And until those two records could be reconciled, I knew there was still another piece of the story waiting to be discovered. That evening, I carried the credit card statements, the receipt I had found in Thomas's desk, and my notebook back to my bedroom. I didn't spread them across the bed the way I had done on previous nights. Instead, I placed everything neatly on the small writing desk beside the window. For several minutes, I simply sat there without opening a single folder. The room was quiet. The only sound came from the old clock on the dresser. Tick, tick, tick. Its steady rhythm gave me time to think. Not about the numbers on the statements. Not about the receipt. About myself. More specifically, about the woman I had been only a few months earlier. I realized something that surprised me. If all of this had happened before Thomas died, I probably would have closed the folder almost immediately. I would have accepted the first reasonable explanation someone offered. Then I would have gone on with my day. That wasn't because I was naive. It was because trust had always been the foundation of our family. For 42 years, Thomas and I rarely questioned one another's intentions. If something didn't make sense, we talked about it. Usually, the explanation was simple. Life became easier when you believed the people you loved. I had lived that way for decades. Perhaps that was why the changes after Thomas's passing felt so confusing. One unexpected event might be explained on its own. Two might still be coincidence. But as I sat quietly in my room, I found myself remembering the months behind me. The first thing that came to mind was the front door. The day I returned home from my husband's funeral and discovered the locks had already been changed. At the time, I had accepted the explanation. It was for security. There would be many visitors after the funeral. The house contained important documents. Those reasons sounded sensible. Maybe they were. I still couldn't say otherwise. Then I thought about the family photographs. My wedding picture. Daniel's childhood portraits. The photographs that had quietly disappeared from the walls. Again, there had been an explanation. The house was being updated. The decorations were changing. The newer photographs better reflected the family's current style. That explanation also sounded reasonable. Then I remembered my granddaughter. Her quiet question in the backyard. "Grandma, why did you leave your family?" When I later asked about it, I received another explanation. Children misunderstand adult conversations. They overhear only parts of stories. They fill in the missing pieces themselves. Once again, entirely possible. Now there were the credit card statements. And once again, another explanation had arrived almost immediately. Delayed processing. Merchant names that don't clearly identify stores. Normal credit card procedures. Everything I had heard over the past several weeks shared something in common. None of the explanations sounded impossible. In fact, most sounded perfectly reasonable. That realization was important, because I wasn't sitting there thinking someone had obviously lied to me. I wasn't. What I noticed instead was something much quieter. Every time I asked a difficult question, an explanation appeared very quickly, calmly, confidently, often before anyone suggested looking for additional records. I opened my notebook and slowly turned through the pages. The locksmith's receipt, the missing photographs, the conversation with my granddaughter. The credit card statements. The receipt from Thomas's desk. One page after another. I noticed something else. Each time I had asked a question, I had received words. But very rarely had I received documents that fully answered those questions. Again, that didn't prove anything. Many conversations don't require paperwork. Life doesn't come with receipts for every misunderstanding. Still, I found myself becoming more aware of the difference between an explanation and evidence. Thomas used to explain that difference whenever we worked on finances together. He would smile and say, "An explanation tells you what might have happened. A record helps you understand what actually did." At the time, he had been talking about balancing accounts. Now those words carried a much broader meaning. I wasn't becoming suspicious of everyone around me. That wasn't what was changing. Something else was changing instead. I was becoming more careful, more patient, less willing to stop searching simply because the first answers sounded believable. That surprised me. I had spent most of my adult life believing that asking too many questions made people seem distrustful. Now I wondered if there was another way to look at it. Perhaps asking respectful questions wasn't a sign of distrust at all. Perhaps it was simply part of understanding. I walked over to the window and looked out into the dark backyard. Thomas had loved that view. The old maple tree stood quietly beneath the porch light. Everything outside appeared peaceful. Inside, my thoughts continued turning. I realized grief had changed me, not only because I missed my husband, but because it had forced me to become responsible for understanding things he had once handled so effortlessly. Financial records, legal papers, insurance documents, questions I had rarely needed to ask before. In a strange way, those responsibilities were changing how I saw the world. Not making me harder, making me more attentive. I returned to the desk and placed every document neatly back into its folder. Then I picked up my notebook one last time before bed. On a fresh page, I wrote only a single sentence. A reasonable explanation is valuable, but understanding often requires more than an explanation alone. I read the sentence twice, then closed the notebook. As I turned off the bedside lamp, I realized something that felt both sad and strangely empowering. The woman I had been before Thomas died trusted first and questioned later. The woman I was becoming still wanted to trust. I hoped I never lost that. But I had also learned something I wished I had understood much earlier. Trust and careful verification are not enemies. They can exist together. You can respect the people you love, listen to their explanations with an open heart, and still take the time to look carefully at the facts. Not because you expect to find wrongdoing, but because the truth deserves more than assumptions. It deserves patience. It deserves honesty. And sometimes, it deserves one more question before you decide the search is over. That night, I waited until the house had become completely quiet. Daniel had gone upstairs. The grandchildren were asleep. Even the dishwasher had finished its cycle. Silence settled over the house in the way it only can after midnight. I carried the folder of financial records into my bedroom and closed the door behind me. The small wooden box was already waiting on top of my writing desk. It had belonged to Thomas for as long as I could remember. For years, it held little things that mattered only to him. Old pocket watches that no longer worked. A fountain pen his father had given him. A few handwritten notes. Nothing especially valuable. At least not in the way most people measure value. After his funeral, the box slowly became something different. Without planning it, I had begun placing inside it the pieces of our family's story that I never wanted to lose. Not because I expected anyone else to read them, because I wanted one place where memory would not have to compete with uncertainty. I unlocked the tiny brass clasp and lifted the lid. Everything rested exactly where I had left it. The locksmith's receipt from the afternoon of Thomas's funeral. The old family photographs I had rescued from the attic. My granddaughter's drawing of our family holding hands. The notebook pages describing conversations exactly as I remembered them. Each item represented a different moment, a different question, a different reason to keep paying attention. I reached for the folder beside me. One by one, I removed the papers. First came the credit card statements. I tapped the stack lightly against the desk to straighten the edges before placing them into the box. Next came the receipt I had found inside Thomas's desk. I slipped it into a protective envelope so it wouldn't become damaged over time. Then I added the pages from my notebook listing the transaction dates I wanted to understand more clearly. Not accusations, not conclusions, simply dates, merchant names, questions. Finally, I took out a clean sheet of paper. Across the top, I wrote in careful block letters, Things I still need to verify beneath the heading. I began making a list. Confirm how the credit card company records purchase dates and posting dates. Determine whether merchant names match the actual businesses involved. Review additional receipts, if any can be located. Compare statements with other financial records. I stopped writing for a moment, then added one more line. Avoid assumptions. Follow the documents. I looked at those words for a long time. Then I smiled faintly. They sounded exactly like something Thomas would have written. He always believed that careful records were calmer than uncertain memories. I reached for another blank note card. This one wasn't a checklist. It was a reminder to myself. In neat handwriting, I wrote, "Don't rely on memory. Rely on what has been recorded." I read the sentence twice, then placed the card inside the wooden box, resting it on top of the other papers. That single sentence somehow made me feel steadier. Grief changes memory. Time changes memory. Conversations become shorter. Details blur. People remember the same event differently. Documents are not perfect either, but they preserve moments in a way memory sometimes cannot. That realization had quietly become one of the most important lessons of the past several weeks. I closed the folder and looked once more inside the box. Only a few months earlier, it had contained keepsakes from my husband's life. Now it held something more. A timeline. A collection of records. Questions waiting patiently beside photographs. At first glance, the contents looked completely unrelated. A locksmith's receipt. Old family pictures. A child's drawing. Credit card statements. Handwritten notes. Yet I understood the connection. Every item represented a moment when I had chosen not to depend solely on what I thought I remembered. Instead, I had preserved what could actually be reviewed later. That distinction mattered. More than ever. I gently lowered the lid, but didn't close it immediately. Instead, I rested both hands on the edges of the box. I realized it had become noticeably heavier. Not because of the wood. Not even because of the growing stack of papers. Its weight came from something less tangible. Every document inside represented a question that still didn't have a complete answer. Some questions might eventually prove to have simple explanations. Others might lead nowhere at all. I accepted that. Not every loose thread becomes an important discovery. But I also knew something else. Questions ignored rarely answer themselves. I finally closed the lid and fastened the small brass clasp. The quiet click echoed softly through the room. For a long moment, I simply looked at the box. If someone else had opened it that night, they probably would have seen nothing remarkable. Just old papers, photographs, receipts, notes. To me, it represented something entirely different. It marked the moment I stopped hoping my memory alone would carry me through difficult times. Instead, I began trusting careful records, patient observation, and the willingness to keep learning. Before turning out the light, I opened my notebook one final time. On the last page, beneath everything I had written over the previous weeks, I added one final sentence. The truth doesn't become clearer because we remember harder. It becomes clearer when we are willing to preserve the facts and return to them with patience. I closed the notebook, placed it beside the wooden box, then turned off the bedside lamp. The room disappeared into darkness. But beside my bed sat a box that had grown much fuller than it had been only a few weeks before. Not simply because it contained more paper, but because it now carried the growing weight of questions that still deserved honest answers. And somehow, I felt certain that before this journey was over, every page inside that box would matter. Before going to bed, I paused beside the small table next to my bed. Thomas's photograph was still there. It was the same picture I had looked at every night since the day he was gone. He was standing in our backyard, wearing his favorite blue flannel shirt, smiling the quiet smile that had carried me through 42 years of marriage. I picked up the frame and held it in both hands. For a long moment, I simply looked at his face. There were so many things I wished I could still ask him. So many questions I wished he were here to answer. Instead, I found myself speaking softly into the silence. "If you were here," I whispered, "I think you'd tell me to stay calm and understand everything before reaching any conclusions." I smiled through tired eyes. That had always been Thomas. Whenever life became confusing, he never rushed to judgment. He gathered information. He listened carefully. He checked the facts. Only then did he decide what he believed. Somehow, without realizing it, I had begun following the same advice. I carefully placed his photograph back on the table. Next to it sat the little wooden box. Inside were the locksmith's receipt, The old family photographs, my granddaughter's drawing, the credit card statements, the receipt from Thomas's desk, my handwritten notes. None of those papers told the whole story by themselves. But together, they reminded me of something important. The truth rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it reveals itself one small piece at a time. I reached over and gently rested my hand on the lid of the box. "I'll keep looking," I said quietly. "Not because I want someone to lose, but because I owe us the truth." The room fell silent again. I turned off the bedside lamp. Darkness settled around me. For the first time in weeks, I felt strangely peaceful. Not because I had all the answers, because I had finally stopped pretending I didn't have questions. I had barely closed my eyes when the sound shattered the silence. Ding dong. The doorbell. I looked at the clock beside my bed. It was far later than anyone normally visited. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then the bell rang again. I slipped on my robe and slowly walked downstairs. When I opened the front door, a delivery driver stood on the porch holding a large envelope. "Mrs. Anderson?" "Yes. I have a certified delivery for you." I signed the electronic pad and accepted the envelope. It felt heavier than ordinary mail. The return address immediately caught my attention. It was from the bank. In the upper left corner, printed in bold letters, were the words, "Important notice regarding your account." I stood motionless in the doorway. The cool night air drifted into the house, but I hardly noticed. My fingers tightened around the envelope. I hadn't been expecting anything from the bank. Not tonight. Not at all. Slowly, I closed the front door and looked once more at the unopened envelope in my hands. A feeling I couldn't quite explain settled over me. Not fear. Not certainty. Just the unmistakable sense that another piece of the story had arrived, and that whatever was inside this envelope might reveal that the questions surrounding my family's finances had only just begun.